This is okay. This is AA4FL for the grand rounds in the internet. Thank you for everybody being here, and we're going to go ahead and share that other screen now, so that everybody will be ready and see what the presentation is going to be like that. But we probably won't be taking any check-ins during it. We'll do check-ins towards the end if they're late check-ins. But I'm sorry, I'm trying to multitask here and not being successful at it. We appreciate everybody that's here for the Medical Amateur Radio Council, and you should be seeing on the screen right now, the screen that I'm sharing, which is the presentation, which will start here shortly. But at this time, if we could get a president's report from KD5QHV, Bernie, go ahead.
Well, I think it was interesting. The weekend, like I tell you, at the I spent a little bit of time with Jeff. I don't think that I did it, and we talked about it. And we found that a good time. And then it returned to more than COVID. COVID.
Well, thank you for the report, Bernie. I'm glad you made it to Visalia. I know you're a regular. I'll try to join you there one year. It sounds like an enjoyable time. I have Linda checked in, by the way, K5UPK. This is A4FL. And Keith, I'm going to go ahead and just going to mute you there, Keith. I see we've got 5 people on Zoom right now, and the Zoom presentation is being recorded. Keith, if you could nod if you see the presentation up on the share screen, I would appreciate it. This is AA4FL. We'll start momentarily. The Secretary's report, we're trying something a little different in the presentation. Rather than lecture off of, thank you, rather than lecture off of notes that are from like a Word file, I'm actually lecturing off of a PowerPoint presentation, and we're recording it right now on Zoom as well. So we'll be able to publish that as a file later, as a YouTube recording, because many of our members are HF challenged because of antennas and equipment, and they can't participate directly in the net, and they'll be able to view the topic. The Medical Amateur Radio Council is a group of amateurs that are interested in health-related fields or in health-related fields. You don't have to be a member to participate, but please do realize, although we're having discussions about topics that are medically related, this is not diagnosis or medical suggestions. This is information for the general public, as well as for the general amateur public. This is public airwaves here, amateur radio, and anyone can listen. Obviously, you have to have a license to transmit, and those of us here do. This is AA4FL net control, which will also be doing the presentation on microplastics in health here today. But from a Secretary's standpoint, I look forward to seeing everyone in Dayton, Xenia. We're getting ready to go and have a wonderful time. We're going to be at the Air Force Museum of the United States on Thursday. Some of us are coming in on Wednesday. We'll be there all the way through Sunday. So please do stop by the booth. I'm trying to remember the number. I think it's 4008. It's in the same building as the booth for the prizes. They're one of the entrances to the building, so you won't have any trouble finding us. That's not the biggest of the room. So please do stop by, and most of us that are coming are going to be manning the booth. So if you're a member who's hasn't signed up, please do at least stop by and see us. And this is AA for Health, the Medical Amateur Radio Council, very on the net. We're not going to do any late check-ins now because we're recording this presentation, and we're going to move on here momentarily. I'd like to give Chip N5RTF an opportunity to give a report on the other nets today. Go ahead, Chip. Chip, if you're copying, if you could give a report on the digital net and the CW net, go ahead. Yeah, I'm not copying Chip now, so I assume that he stepped away from it and he's handling the recording. So we will have this recorded. It's streamed live at marcoaudio.net. If for some reason you're not hearing, I'm only hearing me, so it's the sole presenter today. It probably won't be necessary, but for going back and reviewing it later, that will be posted in the next day or two on marcoaudio.net, because it's also a recorded stream as well as a live stream. And mine should be up as a YouTube recording. You can reference that using my name at my YouTube channel. So this is AA4FL for the Grand Rounds of the Internet. And today we're talking about microplastics and health. We're talking about microplastics in terms of human health, also talking about nanoplastics. So these are plastics as they enter the environment and as they work their way down in size and don't fully degrade and find their way into health, into the body, and into the food chain. We're going to go over all that right here. But microplastics are plastics that have gotten down to the size of less than 5 millimeters. And when they get smaller and smaller and down to nanoplastics, that's considered to be a micrometer, at least in size, and less than a nanometer. So anywhere from 1,000 nanometers to 1 nanometer in size. We have a 10 to the 6 small size reduction in size. So what happens after that? I mean, do they break down into their chemical components? Do they last forever? We'll discuss that as we go through. There are primary microplastics that start out already 5 millimeters or less in size, like tiny pellets called nurdles that fill toys, micro beads that were once commonly used in personal care products, and that we'll discuss, because that's not being used in toothpaste and cosmetics anymore for many reasons. But there's secondary microplastics that are created when larger plastics break down. And with time, the combination of chemical and physical forces will fragment larger plastics into smaller particles. But how long does it take before they don't exist anymore? The microplastics can be carried into water bodies through wastewater, through stormwater runoff, of course, into the landfills in industrial areas, or by wind. And plastics are a group of materials. They're polymers that can occur in nature or be man-made with a characteristic of being able to be shaped when soft and then hardened into a desired shape. And if we think back to the 1960s, those of us that were familiar with popular culture then, there was a movie, The Graduate, starring Dustin Hoffman. And that he was kind of highlighted with awkward advice in that movie. There was a husband of a close friend of his who he thought was going to discuss another topic, pulled him aside to discuss something with him. And it turned out it was to give him some advice, and that was plastics, which is the way of the future. So products made from plastic are common in manufacturing with many advantages to society, but not without risks. And since the 1960s have been an ever-growing popular product line. There are naturally occurring polymers that are moldable, things like tar, shellac, tortoiseshell, animal horn, cellulose, amber, and there's also latex from tree sap. The natural polymers in the 19th century that were modified chemically into products include cellulose from celluloid, was latex that was made into vulcanized rubber. So think about that. And we wrote about vulcanized rubber in one of our recent editions of the Aether back in June. That's online on the marco-ltd.org website. But the impact on society from that, we got celluloid, we made into films. So what impact on society did that have? An enormous, especially in the age of the silent films in the early 20th century. But what about tires on cars as we got into the 20th century? And what about dentures? That was actually in the 19th century. Dentures were made out of rubber. It was called vulcanite. It was vulcanized rubber. And that started, I believe, in the 1850s. And if you want to go back and review that edition of the Aether to read about vulcanite, there's a great interest. There's a lot of historic medical consideration of how they were developed and why vulcanite dentures. Some of the technology, ironically, still was used even after vulcanite was abated. And vulcanite, as a naturally occurring polymer, was actually replaced by synthetic polymer, by acrylics. And the porcelain teeth that they used in those old vulcanite dentures, they were retained by two metal pins, not carried forth into acrylic. We're going to talk a little more about dental acrylic in terms of the materials. But synthetic polymers used in industry, including polyethylene for plastic bags, polystyrene for styrofoam cups, polypropylene for fibers and bottles, polyvinyl chloride for food wrap, bottles, drain pipes, PVC, and polytetrafluoroethylene, which is Teflon for nonstick surfaces. So these polymer chains are primarily hydrocarbons of carbon and hydrogen, but they can also contain oxygen, chlorine, fluorine, nitrogen, silicon, phosphorus, and sulfur. I'm just going to bring the transmitter down for just 1 second. This is AA4FL, Alpha Alpha 4 Foxtrot Lima. This is the Grand Rounds of the Internet, open to all amateurs. Don't have to be a Medical Amateur Radio Council member. This topic is of general interest to the amateur community, and you'll see an example of a microplastics that were used in industry that you will identify with. And please share this. It will be on YouTube. You can look up my call sign, and they'll be on my YouTube channel. You can share this with family. But going back to the plastics, we talked about primary and secondary microplastics, those that already started out less than 5 millimeters, which were cosmetics, personal care products, pharmaceuticals, detergents, insecticides, but also those bigger products, secondary microplastics. They start off large and they actually become microplastics secondarily as they break down. Things like fishing gear, plastic bottles, plastic bags, plastic food containers. And there's many different components that we just talked about that synthetics, microplastics are made of. So, how are they? That's how they used. But they arrived in the 20th century, the fully synthetic ones. In 1907, we talked about electronics. Bakelite became available to the industry. That's no stranger. We've all seen radios made out of that. But semi-synthetic fibers hit the scene in 1911 with rayon developed from cellulose. So we talk about culture, we talk about history, we talk about society. Sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. Think about what happened with World War II as these these supply chains were either broken, or actually think of the source of World War II. So the participation as a contribution to some countries not having access to oil. And then after the war started, us not having, and here in the West, not necessarily having the supplies from the Far East, which were the latex. So a lot of reasons for synthetics to be developed because of the critically short supply of things like latex, wool, silk, etc. And we also could have mass production out of that dire need, because during war, there often was the need for much more volume of the products. And there were during peace. So development ensued. Synthetic tires were used for tires in military and civilian applications. Nylon replaced silk and parachutes in consumer products. The plastic industry is still one of the fastest growing in the United States and the world. It produces about 150 kilograms of polymers per person annually in the United States. So we're talking about polymers, which is combining monomers. And it occurs in two manners of production. There's addition, or there's condensation polymerization. And those resulting chains of molecules can be linear, they can be cross-linked. And I mentioned dental acrylics, denture teeth, I mentioned porcelain teeth. Porcelain teeth have two pins held in the acrylic denture. They've replaced that now with acrylic teeth that are directly connected to the acrylic of the pink acrylic of the denture base. And unfortunately, years ago, they weren't adopted as quickly as we would have liked because of the wear factor. They were not extensively cross-linked. And over time, they found out ways to increase their wear resistance. Now the products are much different. They're cross-linked and durable, and we don't get the clatter and shatter in the weight of porcelain teeth anymore. So one can see how we're talking about a subject matter such as plastics and synthetic plastic currently, but you can see it's much more wide-ranging. We're in a world, just like if Dustin Hoffman was told, the future is plastics, like he was told in the grant. And what about the future? What about mass manufacturing not being the only outlet for plastic parts and items? What if you could make it yourself at home? Or we had a conversation about habitation on the moon, habitation on Mars. We can't bring everything by spaceship. But what about 3D printing? Would that be quite possible? I mean, obviously, if you're an individual now and you have a 3D printer and you need to manufacture a part, you can do that at home. But the applications of the technology are even space age. So they'll be important. And if you'd like to review that past discussion that we had on the marco-ltd.org website, we have some information in the Aether about that written up as well. N5RTF records all our sessions here on marcoaudio.net. And the two ground rounds of the air sessions from January 2024. If you'd like to review those, where we talked about 3D printing in the context of those heavenly bodies, as well as other aspects of habitation and medical considerations, please do review that. I'm going to pause for a second for ID. This is Alpha Alpha 4 Foxtrot Lima for the Grand Rounds on the Air Net. We're an organization of individuals in interested medical fields or professionals in medical fields. However, our organization is open to anyone who has interest, and I hope as patients who would have an interest in the materials. Today we're talking about synthetic plastics. We're talking about nanoplastics, microplastics, and we'll be talking about it with a tinge or a lean towards the medical considerations of it. Right now, we're just talking about practical considerations. So thinking of this dental consideration, and there's lots of different types of plastic used in 3D printing. The dentistry is a little bit different. Dental composite resins are also used in fillings in addition to dentures. And that's made a little bit differently, and they're widely used in dentistry. They're often called dental polymer composites to provide direct aesthetic tooth resembling restoration. So, sometimes we have situations in life where we develop a product for a particular reason. In this particular case, it's not just the cosmetics that they were developed. They're replacements for metal. Their advantages, obviously cosmetically. But to explain a little bit about dental silver fillings, the concern was the mercury that was incorporated into those fillings. Of course, they mixed the silver and the mercury and made another component, dental amalgam, that really has not directly been shown to be a health risk, although common sense says that you should consider it as such. In some parts of the world, they don't use it anymore because we have better alternatives. But there are more reasons for that than just health considerations. Silver fillings required that the teeth have retentive features to hold the fillings with them. Retentive features being sharp internal angles, what we call undercuts, which can compromise the tooth structure over time. Think about an axe blade. You have a sharp axe blade, and that's what you would use to cleave a piece of wood if you were doing a fireplace wood, and taking an axe and cleaving it in half. Now think about a tooth that has a silver filling in it. As we get older, our teeth tend to become a little drier and more cracks. And I can personally attest to this because I had two molars that had the smallest of fillings. And the further back in the mouth you go, the higher the stress is. And both those molars on the lower right and lower left were actually lost because they cleaved in half and could not be restored. And I had to have implants. But that's one of the reasons. And obviously that reduces stress. It keeps parts of the tooth from breaking, less likely to need crowns. It's not always about tooth loss. But what about the serum levels of components? Is that also an issue? I mean, what about biomimicry? Is that what we're actually talking about here? We're talking about the ability to mimic natural structure, taking a cosmetic filling. Is it all about cosmetics? Or is it trying to make it look biologically natural? Is that the only biomimicry that goes on with a dental material? There are components to dental materials, and BPA, or bisphenol A, is one of many. There's about 5 or 6 monomers used in dentistry that are derivatives from bisphenol A. And they've been around in certain plastics and resins since the 1950s. But it's been noted that there's small and transient increases in baseline BPA levels in the patient's urine and saliva following treatment with resin-based dental materials. So what does that mean? Did we just trade the potential for mercury for the potential for plastic components? What is the biocompatibility? How much has that been studied? I mean, you can counter that as a dentist by following the manufacturer directions, because some of that increase, the transient increase in baseline levels, is due to not following the instructions. Having issues with the polymerization because of the curing of the particular materials. Dental materials are cured by light. They're light activated for the most part in dental fillings. And there's other components to it. There's fillers to make them hard and wear resistant. Some research has shown that BPA can seep into food or beverages from containers that are also made with BPA. So you'd have to get a non-BPA container, or also any other product line that potentially would have it. And that's a concern because we just don't know what the possible health effects on the brain and prostate glands of fetuses, infants, children's behavior. Just additional research suggests a possible link between BPA and increased blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. So, here we are having a presentation about nanoplastics and microplastics. Philosophically speaking, the presentation shouldn't be answering all the questions. We're not earning a PhD here talking about these particular discussion points in 45 minutes. What I'd like you to take away from the presentation here is that we're actually asking more questions because of investigating the topic. So please do contact me if you don't have access to the YouTube I'm going to post later. I'll have all the links for you if you want to further inquire, and you're welcome to email me at my QRZ address. I'd be more than happy to send the presentation to you so you can inquiring minds want to know, you might say. But what about endocrine disrupting chemicals? What about dental fillings? That is a potential argument. One of the highest volume chemicals in the worldwide production, so we know a little bit about there. And it's used in a wide variety of products. The exposure is documented to virtually everyone in the United States. So I'm going to just drift for a second here and tell you about a personal experience about the topic I wrote about in the late 1990s. We had a researcher at the University of Florida that developed a modified, genetically modified bacteria to not produce the acid that causes tooth decay. And of course, that time genetically modified anything was not a uh, very popular term or a product, anything that had the potential of corn, whatever was genetically modified. It wasn't understood as accepted as much as it is now. And the particular product here came down to a matter of practicality. So parents did not want to put genetically modified anything in their children's mouth for something as unthreatening as dental decay. I mean, dental decay does cause a lot of disease and damage, but compared to at least the prevailing thought at the time, they had to weigh it on the scales against their children getting exposed to something genetically modified. But I think probably the true reason that didn't enter the marketplace is if you think about bacteria in the mouth, if you give it to one person and they accept the terms of use, that's fine. But what if they kiss somebody? What if they pass it along and enters the general population? Then you have someone that's been exposed to it when it's entered into the wild, and they haven't given permission. I think that would be a little bit of a lie. But going back here to our current discussion point on endocrine disrupting chemicals, probably if parents knew what white colored fillings had in them, they'd probably ask more questions. But the research is not is fully explored to prove that point. And we'll also talk about other aspects of that, because perception can be keen, but sometimes reality is obscene. We had microplastics intentionally put into products as beads. That's been banned since 2015. Why? Well, plastic microbeads are solid plastic particles less than 5 millimeters. They're intended to be used to exfoliate or cleanse the body, things like cosmetics. They could be in toothpaste as well, to help with getting debris off the teeth. And the law in 2015 that covers that and eliminated or banned their use included toothpaste, intentionally added microbeads there, as well as this cosmetics we talked about. So why would Congress pass this law? There were concerns about the microbeads in the water supply as the tiny plastic beads go down the drain. And the concern was that, again, we talk about the ability to have action, that they may not be filtered through treatment filtration systems. They end up in our lakes and oceans where they may be mistaken for food by small fish and other wildlife, even though there's no claimed evidence suggesting that plastic microbeads, as used in cosmetics, pose a human health concern. So again, it was a risk versus benefit relationship. I'm going to pause here to also identify. This is AA4FL for the Grand Rounds on the year. The Medical Amateur Radio Council Grand Rounds takes place every week at this time. And we cover medical topics. It's not medical advice. We cover topics out of general interest to the population. We're amateurs on the public airwaves, and these are topics of general interest to all amateurs, and perhaps also to your friends and family. So this particular presentation is being recorded, and we'll get that up on YouTube. And if you are a member of Marco, you'll get that link through our Google Groups listserv. If you're not a member of Marco and you want to obtain the link, you can go on YouTube and you look up my call sign AA4FL and look up the YouTube channel, and that will be present for you. So again, talking about the microbeads and talking about chemicals and breakdown. So if we can't filter that out, and do they get smaller? What happens if they get into the body? How do we break down different chemicals regardless? Plastic products, they're such a convenience. There's all kinds of research that talks about that and what the possibilities might be, but the overwhelming volume of plastic that enters in the oceans, I think we're talking about 10 million tons annually, and 73% of beach litter is plastic. So what do you do to counter that? Think about all the primary microplastics, the things that are already smaller. What about industrial and urban dust? What about synthetic textiles? tires and road use and personal care products. And of course, those plastic pellets that we talk about. And then what happens with our secondary or larger plastics that become microplastics? That's why they're secondary microplastics. They don't start off as microplastics. They end up in the waste. Or in the ocean, it could be things as simple as fishing nets, but with 10 million tons of plastic going into the ocean, you can see it's entering the environment on beaches, on our seafloors. I'm sure all of you have seen some of the stories about the garbage area in the Pacific that some individual or group of individuals is trying to clean up because they recognize the problem. I can't remember what the great garbage dump is called. It's there at the surface. And we all know what a risk plastics can be. Forget the microplastics for a second, put that aside. But think about the 6-can plastics that hold them together when they're distributed. And what would happen if that a turtle or a bird would get into that? It'd be quite a problem. So how do microplastics break down? And can they enter? These are the questions. And any topic is better to be better in creating more questions than answers, because I don't know the answers. Can they enter through the human body and through the food chain? What about respiratory entry for the environment? And who says they're only in the water? I mean, are they in the soils? Do they become forever chemicals, or they just continue to break down to non-existence? And do the particles remain in the body? I don't know the answers to all those questions. I'm not a PhD in material science or into biophysiology, but the transfer occurs at the tropics. We know that in the water, there's nanoplastics and microplastics, and they're inevitably going to move up the food chain. And whether they come from the soil and from the air, secondarily through products or through that runoff, right, the potential is there for us to have our health affected. But don't assume it's all water. There's plastic particles in the soil. We have translocation too, to the plants, to the animals. They would pick up the plastics or the chemical components from the plastics. We have things like floods, irrigation, plastic mulch, municipal waste degradation, sludge and fertilizer, wind. There's all kinds of ways for plastics to get into the environment. And we also have other harbingers potentially to find its way up the food chain on the agricultural side before it gets into the animals. What about sources, the formation, toxicity? There's an entire article, and I will be distributing that with the YouTube video. All the links are actually, everything I'm talking about comes from an article. I'm not, this is even vetted. We talked about it this morning on our digital net, which we always do. We have a group of about 7 or 8 people meet earlier in the morning and discuss the topic and get feedback and input. But the microplastics, can you have a biological detection way? Let me go
mute the computer here.
Hang on, let me mute you here. Okay, thank you. What about blood? What about human stool, sputum, and saliva? Can you monitor that? What about toxicity, toxicology profiles? What about the actual chemicals that are entering that? Do certain people react differently to that? What is it doing to humankind? Well, we live in a toxic world. Chip and 5-RTF, and I were talking about that today. I mean, there's things you can avoid, and there's things you can't avoid. We don't have the choice or control over everything we do in our environment, but what's going to happen in the long term to mankind? We're going to be able to adapt. What about the cumulative stress of adapting? As all the different fronts we have to our health, are they cumulative? Are they additive? Time will tell. What about treatment technologies and strategies for avoiding it? For taking care of any health issues that might arise, and do we even know if they're health issues? And what about research? If the research is done on mice, does that also transfer to men in practicality? I mean, there's lots of medical questions to consider. How do you do a research study on humans for all this? Who would you study? Would it be men, women? I mean, you think about women and fertility and pregnancy, maternal exposure for your progeny, for your offspring. A healthy pregnancy depends on complex regulation of maternal fetal immunological balance. The risks to exposure to polystyrene, for example, in the first trimester are still unknown. I don't know if the other chemicals, if that's been studied. What about microplastic mediated inflammatory diseases? If you're exposed to microplastics through contaminated food, does that activate the immune system and decrease the number of gut microorganisms? Does that potentially harm human health? And there's plenty of other areas of concern that either have started to be studied, need to be studied fully. We don't have the answers to. Obviously, if we did, these would be banned products. But immunotoxicity, microplastic mediated infectious diseases, induced pulmonary diseases, cardiovascular diseases, intestinal diseases. And what about cancer? Those are all questions. Doesn't mean that we're going to find the relationship there, but it still needs to be studied. And what can we do? I mean, can we develop bioplastics that aren't made from oil? Will they be different? Will they break down differently? What happens? Do we recycle some of these products to keep them out of the food chain? Do we pick materials that are biodegradable, that are, say, made out of corn? I mean, just in wrapping this up, we're going to talk about that, but some of the alternatives include those areas of consideration. And that comes from an article that the NIH has online. So let's wrap up plastics. Maybe that's a micro pun. But be aware, as microplastics are only one aspect of a potentially toxic environment. Microplastics, nanoplastics have been widely studied, but in the context of the marine environment, not so much yet for their effect on human health, and obviously it's extremely important. But what are the human exposure pathways? We just talked about some of them. And what about the results of this exposure? And we need to study that. Ingestion and inhalation are the two most likely paths of entry. So toxicity assessments of both microplastics and nanoplastics in human health can be focused on gastrointestinal pulmonary toxicity first, and moved on to other venues, because what processes are involved? Is there oxidative stress from exposure, the inflammatory reactions that we talked about in the GI, in the gut, metabolic disorders, metabolism disorders? We just need to do research for potential mechanisms. So follow the unfolding science, consider discussing these issues with friends, family, patients. What about alternatives? Things like glass, water bottles. Perhaps in the public domain, there's been plenty of articles, I know I've seen them, about using water bottles that have been exposed to heat, leaving a plastic water bottle in your car. I mean, do you actually get some intrusion of microplastics into that water? And you've got options for using metal containers, for using glass containers. And glass, obviously, it's going to break. Metal is not. Plus, you have ecological reasons to not use plastic water bottles. And if you think about different grades of water bottles, some of them are very thin, some of them are thicker. I don't know as a consumer what the implications of that are. Is there a reason why they're thinner or thicker? Is it the weight and distribution? Is there a medical reason for that? Why? One thing Chip brought up this morning on 5RTF, why, or actually it was Jerry that brought that up in 4TSC. Why is there a date on the water bottles? What does that actually mean to have an expiration date on water bottles? Is there a reason for it? Does it have something to do with the capability and probability of creating microplastics? I don't know the answer. We talked about it. None of us did. It was a great question, Jerry. Thank you for asking it earlier this morning in our meeting. But again, follow that unfolding science. Look out for times of potential risk for patients and friends. I mean, it may be worth mentioning that around times of pregnancy for women. And as the science indicates, watch for signs and symptoms of the effects of those close to you, and just read up on the subject. And also, we'll cover forever chemicals in the near future with a follow-up study. So There's about 12 resources and links used for creating today's presentation. And once again, that will be available on the recorded PowerPoint, which will actually be this presentation in the form of a video on YouTube. We're recording this on Zoom. So at this point, I know we haven't done any late check-ins, but is there anybody else that would like to check in at this point? Please go ahead and make your call to AA4FL. Okay, I've got, I believe, Kilo Charlie 3, Yankee Victor Quebec, and Victor Echo 3 Sierra India Zulu. Is that correct, QSL? Okay, well, thank you for being here with us. Any other late check-ins before we open up for questions? Keith M3IM, are you still here? I know somebody said they fell asleep. I think that might have been you in Virginia, Dave. Maybe I'm wrong. Am I that monotone? N3IM, Keith, would you like to look for some late check-ins? Go ahead.
Okay, this is N3IM. 16 micro, 16 micro, 60 dm radio countdown. Ground speed. Which is N3IM, the MP3 Indian mic. Standing by. Nothing there, Jay.
Okay, thank you for asking. I appreciate everybody's patience. Sorry to do the presentation this way in 10-minute increments with identification in between, but we're recording. Usually we break in between for check-ins and questions. But are there any questions? I'll take a list from those that have comments or questions. I guess I did put everybody to sleep. No comments or questions. This is AA4FL. Make your call.
Okay, this is KM2M.
Okay, thank you, Dave. KM2M, go ahead.
Roger, yeah, you mentioned the World War II and things, and I just wanted to mention for all the listeners the tragedy of fighting World War II and fighter aircraft made with plastic canopies led to the investigation and the use of plastics for intraocular lens implants. It was discovered that fighter pilots who had eye injuries had these little plastic particles in the corneas, sometimes deeper in the eye. Those particles were well exposed. He eventually came to the use of polymethyl metacolate PMMA lenses as the first lens implants that were actually done in England in the late 1940s. So people may find that little sensitive fact very interesting regarding plastics and plastics in the body. And of course, now all the lens implants we put inside the human body now for cataract surgery are typically made of plastics. Jay, AA4FL, that was a wonderful, absolutely fabulous presentation, Jay. Excellent, excellent.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the compliments, but even more important, thank you very much for the input. I was not aware of that. And, it's interesting the way that happens. I'm trying to remember dental implants where they were trying to recover screws from one of the animals that they were using for research, and they found out that they integrated into bone. So, serendipitously, often we'll find discoveries that weren't intended, and have World War II be a part of it. And of course, the technologies and so many things we talked about with synthetics here being developed as a sidebar from World War II. KN0S, Dave, do you have any information similar to that? Over. Okay, KN0 asks Dave, do you still copy me? Okay, we lost Dave here. Any other further comments or questions? Yeah, I stopped the share on here, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this time. And then if anybody would like to ask personal comments as we close down the we can go ahead and do. So this is AA for the medical and radio programs around the internet, bringing that to a close, opening up to the general amateur community, but personally will be here for discussions. Thanks for stopping by this week. I believe we're talking about digital radio next week, USB dongles in particular. And the week after, I believe, Dave, KM2M, and NM2K, Diane are going to be talking about women in image radio in anticipation of upcoming Mother's Day. So all that will be coming up in the near future. This is AA for Stopping the recording.